Good. Hello, go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for showing up. My name is Damratoski. Basically, I do DLP work. I got started in security about 13 years ago in the Beltway. And then about 7 years ago, I fell into DLP by accident and pretty much never looked back. So this is kind of my passion for time. And what I try to do typically with these talks is just throw out some basic information on how to actually implement it in a practical way, and then answer any questions. So if you ask questions, you can go and do that, or you can also wait. All right. So what is DLP? How many people in here have either touched it willingly or unwillingly in the last few years? All right. Good. You know where I'm coming from. So at the end, all these new security technology tools are out there. What separates DLP from the rest of the snorts and the IPSs out there? We'll get into that. The next item we'll talk about is how to go ahead and use DLP in a little bit different way than you would a typical technology product, where we're using a more business-driven approach. We'll go into the three main types of DLP, and those acronyms there we'll get into. Basically, DIM is data in motion, so that's anything on the network wire. DIU is endpoint, that's data in use, as we typically call it. And then DAR. DAR is anything at rest, which kind of also crosses over into data in use, too. Am I okay? Don't move around, I know. A couple other items we'll get into is, all right, so we've got this fancy, cool technology tool out there. It's working. It's catching what we want it to. How do I get value from it? How do I communicate the results of what we're working on to your management? How do we provide value? How do we improve the world and fix our problems? And the last thing we'll do here is we're going to go through two use cases to kind of apply some of what I will talk about today into your environment. Okay, what is DLP? So what's the big difference between this tool and everything else out there? That first word right there is the key word. This is context-driven, right? We're looking at data. We're looking at what is the content of that data. What is the context? Is that just a number that looks like a social, or is that really claimed social security number, let's say if you're in a healthcare company? And we want to look at that regardless of where we apply the technology, whether it's on the endpoint, on the network, or at rest. Another item, a subset of that, is once we do have our context identified, what can we do with it? The end goal, eventually, at some point, is prevention. We want to be able to take data that we feel very confident about that really is sensitive to our organization, and we eventually want to stop it. We want to stop it leaking in an email. We want to stop it leaking in a USB stick. There's a couple other use cases we'll get to that. The second bullet point there is another key one. This is another thing, along with context, is it's a business-driven tool, right? So what I mean by business-driven is, okay, we know the technology side. We're all technologists in here. We have our passions. We have things we like to work on. But this tool, you've got to understand what your business is trying to do, what your business is supposed to do. And then DLP is going to try to protect you from what the business is not supposed to do. And so what I mean by that is we're going to get into a couple other slides here talking about a business workshop where we figure out, normal claims data can go from our company to our insured company. Some other partners we might deal with, things like that. So once you understand what is acceptable, what is normal, what is low risk, we can go ahead and start working on, what are the big uglies, what are the gotchas, and what are we trying to stop. All right, business-driven approach. Okay, so here are the three key steps, and we kind of coined this term a workshop. And before we, if we're doing a new DLP program or even cleaning up something you've been running for a while, where do we start? We don't start with technology first. I know that's counterintuitive to what we're doing with the rest of us in this room right now. What we sit down is we just talk data. We talk what kind of data you have that you care about, what is sensitive. Maybe it's generic, common data, like PHI, PII, socials, credit cards. Those are all pretty standard. But maybe you're in a unique industry, or your company works in a certain space where you have, obviously, and everyone has this somewhere at your company, data that's unique to you, to your environment, that protects you, that's your intellectual property. Maybe in a manufacturing company, those are CAD drawings, design documents for whatever your company sells. And so you kind of want to think out of the box. End goal there is you kind of just want to jot down what are the main cores of sensitive data that we have, whether it's obvious or not, and then we'll start, pointing the technology to that. The first step there is really kind of identify what are your normal business processes. And what I mean by that is what is known acceptable use of transfer of information, whether it's internally or externally or outside coming in. If we can't understand really what is normal, how are you going to stop the unnormal? How are you going to stop the high risk? Maybe that sales team is allowed to send PHI or PII on the road when they're making sales presentations to those USB sticks, but the rest of the company or organization cannot do that. So without knowing that ahead, you might go say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and turn on USB blocking across the whole company, and when those group of salespeople are on the road trying to do their job, you just stop them. And we want to try to avoid as many of those kind of situations as we can. Second sub-bullet there, what's acceptable use? Again, if we don't know what's normal, how can we define unnormal? And really, in any DLP program, regardless of which vendor you go with, if you can't define what's acceptable, it's hard to move forward. It's hard to just gain value from the product because, again, if I don't know the rules, how am I breaking them? The third sample there, or the third sub-bullet, is really important. Once you've gone past the whole little workshop mentality, you take a step back and you go, all right, I'm going to go back to my lab, and I'm going to start applying the technology aspect of DLP. And what that is sample content of what you want to protect. And you might say, well, I just want to protect medical data. Okay, well, I can go ahead and click a couple buttons in an out-of-box policy, and call it PHI, look for some couple keywords, and a social, and then boom, we're off to the races. Well, yes, you can do that as a start. However, if you've got unique claims forms, you've got unique CAD drawings, I need to see some of those samples so I can go ahead and start working on the policy side of things, which we'll get to. Okay, so we've done the workshop, and we've talked all things data now. The second main step is we have to decide where we want to start with our program. Maybe your programs are running for a few years, and you're comfortable on the network side. Maybe some people start on the endpoint. Regardless of where you're at, you need to decide where you want to go. And so kind of the three main areas there, as we talked about, is data in motion. So that's anything mail typically, HTTP, HTTPS. In that context, typically we only look for data leaving the company, right? We're not so concerned about data coming in because we can't stop people from sending us data. We all know this. Maybe you want to start an endpoint. In the past, a lot of companies are hesitant to move to endpoint because that's where you interface the most with the users. And if we don't think things through and plan, we can DOS them. We can cause havoc in certain situations. And then the third point, and this is kind of up and coming, I've seen this in the last few years, is data at rest. So we know that a lot of companies have been out there for a while. They've got a lot of piles of hay of data from 15 years ago they think they need, and they have no idea what went where. And so data at rest basically takes DLP and it is not necessarily preventing it, but you're trying to map where my claims data is, where those CAD drawings are, where my sensitive client files may be. And then from there, as it grows, maybe you start off with, all right, we're just going to mail, and we're just going to monitor egress email. All right, we've done that for 6 months. We're comfortable, we're confident, we haven't caused any major issues, we're getting comfortable in the tool. Maybe you want to move next to the endpoint. And a lot of times where we start on endpoint, it's just basic USB monitoring. All we're doing is monitoring USB. We're not blocking. I want to see how many people are really coming to these conferences that we're sitting in here right now and getting that free USB stick, and then going home and pillaging data. And then once maybe you run that for 6 months, you go, okay, we have a corporate standard, whatever that corporate standard is. Let's just say IronKey. I've seen that in the past. We go ahead and say, all right, we're ready to move to the next step. IronKeys are our approved vendor. We're going to exclude IronKey and let everyone copy to those IronKey devices, and everything else to USB, blocked. And that's another really common area to start with. DLP policies. Okay, so from that workshop we've got all this data. We've got an idea of how it's used, how it's not supposed to use. How do I apply the technologies of DLP besides picking where I want to push it? That's in the policy. Think of a policy as the same version of an antivirus signature, right? Those things get updated up to the hour sometimes. That's looking for that's defining what you're looking for. So we take the context from the workshop, all the data, and then we decide how we want to apply that in the tool. And so you go in there, and on the policy level, there's many different types of technologies, bless you, depending on what you want to use. And this is where we start that discussion. It can be a combination of multiple technologies. For example, one popular area, especially in healthcare and finance, is indexing. And what I mean by that is your company has one source of all client PII, so first name, last name, social. Maybe you have a medical ID if it's a healthcare company. If you're lucky enough to have one system where that's from, we'll actually do a data dump, let's say once a week or once a month, and index every single piece of that data, and we'll turn that into a policy. And so what that says is you can go into DLP and say, hey, if I see first, last, social, create an incident. That's part of the policy logic. Indexing is very powerful. It's our preferred place to start, but in some environments, especially companies that have grown organically, we like to call it, where there used to be 3 different ones, there's 3 different systems for everything, it's not always possible. In addition to that, once we've got that initial index, we can go ahead and write other policy logic that kind of protects our backup. Our first choice is an index. If that doesn't work, we're going to have a plain social with a keyword policy. And so that's kind of a secondary layer of protection, or it could be your primary depending on that. In addition to, there's literally hundreds of others if you want to get really into the weeds, sometimes file type, file size, things like that. When we start off, we typically like to keep the policy logic very simple, right? Let's not overdo it yet. Let's see what the results are. As things get going, or as you get more comfortable with the tool, you can start writing additional logic into the tool to say, hey, in addition to just an index, if I see an index and a person pushing the USB within 24-hour period, boom, I add that logic in there, and it kind of raises the stakes a little bit. It's kind of a more advanced function, but it's something you can definitely move to. And really the goal there is out of the gate with our policies, we want to be as accurate as possible. If we turn on some policies and go into those default and just click a couple buttons and start on Monday morning and turn it on and don't watch it, we create a lot of noise, a lot of false positives. And with DLP, it's kind of like probably writing a sort signature that didn't quite go as you hoped. There's a lot of noise, a lot of false positives. Well, the problem with DLP is if you don't monitor those and keep on top of your false positives, bad things can happen. One, you start ignoring what's in there. You can also get into a legal issue long term where you say, hey, well, we've got all this stuff. We don't have staff or manpower to go through it quickly. And oh, by the way, we got sued recently and we need all that data. We've got to go give it to them. There's actually been documented cases where that happens. So kind of one way to think of a DLP policy is don't monitor or record something that you realistically can't follow up on within, let's say, a 1-week business period or whatever that time period is. So less is definitely better. Deployment planning. Let's start small. We kind of coined the frame crawl, walk, run. Don't go into blocking on the first day, please. Don't go on to the endpoint and start clicking a bunch of buttons where I say, oh, I want to monitor print, and I want to monitor copy to USB, and I want to monitor Outlook, and I want to monitor this and this and this, because without understanding the impact, especially on local machine resources and time, you might hurt yourself. Typically, we like to start with one vector. And the vector, it just depends over time. 5 years ago, it was just network. Everyone just wanted to monitor email. And the reason for that is that, web traffic, we've got proxy servers, so we've got some layer of protection going on there. Lately, some companies have decided to go just on endpoints and skip network, or a combination of both. Pick just a few policies to start with. 3 to 5, that's not an absolute number, but it's a good place to start. What you don't want to do is turn on 30 policies, like I've seen it, and all of a sudden you got all this noise and you don't really understand. You're still learning how the tool works, and you just see red alerts every second, and stuff flows downhill. So start small. As the program matures, as you mature in the console, your team, you guys understand a little more how the tool works, maybe what quirks a little bit. We slowly starting adding maybe new policies, or we decide to say, hey, we've got a lot of risk on the endpoint now. Let's go to the endpoint. Long term, we can eventually get into that prevention mode that we talked about. There is no, after a week you're going to be an expert. There is no timeline on that. It's whenever it's really your organization's appetite for risk and what you're willing to do. Some companies, 100% behind DLP, second week they're blocking, and they've got the management executive backup to do that. Some companies will never move to that. They both are successful DLP programs, but it just kind of what the company expected. Here's another key thing. That last bullet point there is interesting. Sometimes people get DLP confused with Encase. And they go, hey, this person just quit. And he or she took all our client files and a bunch of sales data, or at least we thought they did. Can you guys use DLP to go see what it did? And I go, well, did we have the agent on there? Oh, no. No, I can't. I can't install the agent and look backwards. The DLP does not work until the day you turn on a policy to monitor that or that email account, that web traffic, or that endpoint. And it's from that second forward. So it can't work backwards. It can't go do a forensic analysis and say, hey, last week so-and-so did this. It doesn't work that way. So a lot of times that, it's after the fact, but if you do it right up front, you can kind of protect yourself. All right, data in motion. So now we're going to talk a little more of the techie side. What is data in motion? So data in motion is anything network, typically egress only, and the core are right there: SMTP, HTTP, and HTTPS. So HTTPS is a little bit different. We'll get to that here at the bottom. But basically the rule is if it's unencrypted, or you can break that encryption down with one of your other tools, such as a web proxy or like tool, DLP can see it for the most part. Mail is the most common. It's kind of what got DLP started, let's say, 12, 15 years ago. It still is highly used out there, but as we all know, my personal opinion is we can do a lot more damage with USB sticks than we can with onesie twosie emails. Not to say that emails can't do damage too, but in the book of evil, USB wins. So it can be inline and passive, and what I mean by that is with DLP, if you really want to get into that prevention mode down the road, hopefully, you have to be inline. So let's compare this to an IDS and an IPS system. An IDS system snored, if it's just on a network tap, it's just passive, right? It says, hey, this traffic just went by an hour ago. I can't block it, and it went out the door. You better go after it. Okay. DLP in an inline mode is an IPS system. It's inline. So if that policy that you created last week called PHI sees what you believe to be PHI, it can block it that very second. It can send an email back to the user and say, hey, you violated corporate policy. Here's a link to how to send it securely. Here's a link to compliance training. Whatever you want to do, that option's there. One thing you want to think about when you implement DLP is if you think you're going to go into inline or prevention mode at some point, go ahead and build the tool to do that from the first day if you can. Sometimes that's easier said than done. What you don't want to do is just make it all passive and then your boss comes to you on Monday and says, hey, go ahead and make it in line. I want to block tomorrow. And I go, well, we have to redesign our whole system now. There are some fail-safes in almost all the tools that will allow you to protect yourself from blocking by accident. There is one tool in particular called trial mode. So you click that box and no one in the tool on that server can go ahead and accidentally block until you uncheck that button. So it kind of protects you from yourself. On the website, basically, depending on which vendor you go with, if it supports ICAP or secure ICAP, it'll probably talk to DLP. All the vendors have published sheets out there that talk about, hey, we support these 6 or 8 vendors. Squid's usually on all of them. If your web proxy is not on that, some of the vendors will work with you to kind of hack around it. But if you think you're moving to DLP, or especially if you're going to go into a block mode at some point, definitely focus on buying a tool that matches whatever web proxy systems you currently have. Passive monitoring. This is a little bit older technology, but a lot of times I've seen it used internal to internal, so network 1 to network 2. Or if your organization's in the business of buying smaller companies all the time, like some are, maybe you set this up between you and that new organization to say, hey, I kind of just want to see what's going on behind the scenes. Again, once it's passive, it's always passive, so you just got to keep that in mind. And again, inline is the most important part. If you do want to move to a prevention mode at some point, make sure you build that in up front, especially on the network side. And the last kind of little asterisk there, that's kind of important. DLP can look at HTTPS traffic if you have another tool that gives that traffic decrypted to it. So what I mean by that is that DLP, that no vendor that I'm aware of, is doing man in the middle on any SSL traffic today. However, if you're doing that with a proxy or you're doing that with some other third-party cool tool you bought, fantastic, then DLP can get involved. But DLP itself cannot break down encrypted traffic. Data in use. This has really taken off in the last couple of years. There's a lot of niche vendors that have popped up where they're focusing more on endpoint, whereas others kind of always had endpoint. And what this means is this is anything on a desktop or laptop. Typically, Windows, as we know, is probably the most common commercial use OS out there, and all of them support that. Some of the vendors are moving into the Mac space very quickly. They're not necessarily fully functional on the Mac, but every sub-release they come out with, they're catching up quick because we know that everyone in the corporate world is trying to push to Mac. So what are some of the options there? There's actually a lot of different options. Again, USB is probably the most common place to start, but you can go really far. You can go into just looking at content going to a printer, just looking at content copied to certain network shares. You can do also application monitoring on a local box. You do want to be careful on the endpoint, regardless of what you're doing, is test, test, and test again. And the reason for that is that depending on the tool, there obviously is some RAM and CPU overhead with yet another endpoint client running. If your environment's pretty mature and everyone has 4 or 8 gig RAM on every laptop, world is good. 50 mega RAM, no one's going to notice. But some environments, especially globally, they're still on 1 gig boxes today. And so when you push that new DLP agent out there and tell it to say, hey, start sniffing all my browser activity, things can grind to a halt quick. So you just want to be very, very careful. Kind of think of it as a very precise in what you do. You can also, as with DLP, you can always apply context. Or, what I mean by that is look at the data copied to USB, but only tell me if it matches one of my policies, like those CAD drawings or that PHI. Another example is you can say, hey, just show me the action of copy. Show me any and all copy to USB. That's typically where we like to start. You can also go into printing application monitors we talked about, but those kind of a little more advanced and a little more overhead, so you just want to kind of test that very carefully. That second bullet point there is key. So, let's say we travel a lot, some salespeople travel all the time. Does DLP still work if he or she's traveling? Well, yeah, it works after the last sync. So let's say if you only update your policies once a quarter, you're fine. But if you push out DLP policy updates once an hour, like a antivirus file might, you might have a problem. And the way that works is if I'm on the road and I'm doing bad things on my endpoint, DLP is constantly cataloging that in the background, and it's throwing it into a directory locally. The next time I connect to the network, whether it's over a VPN or I'm sitting at my office, and that next initial connection, that's when the data actually gets pushed. So basically think of it as all that DLP incident data is cached locally until your next connection. That's very important when there's terminations involved, whether willingly or unwillingly. So sometimes you've got an endpoint agent out there running, and that person travels and doesn't come in the office about once a month. And there was a termination there, and all of a sudden, you have their laptop back in their hands. So you've got to make a choice. There may have been DLP incident data out there that we haven't seen yet because you haven't put it on the wire and connected it to the mothership. And so you kind of have to balance that out with whatever forensic processes you have. One thing you don't want to do is you don't want to wipe that drive, that machine, until you've checked and given it time to talk to the DLP software, because if not, you may have erased key information from a DLP perspective. Yeah, so the last bullet point there we talked about a little bit is we can actually write logic in there and say, hey, users are allowed to do X, Y, and Z, but not this other thing. So, typically, like I said, if you have a approved USB device, allow those, block everything else. Some companies don't necessarily have that, and so you kind of have to tread carefully. Data at rest. So this is also growing. This can kind of scare people a lot because you think about how much data large companies have. It's mind-boggling. You're in the petabytes really quick, depending on the size of the company. So this is the newest area of DLP, and it's basically letting you go out and scan your large data repositories. Things like NASs, SharePoint sites. You can do Exchange, and in some certain situations, you can also do databases. The key word here is scale, right? So companies come to you and say, hey, I want you to scan 5 petabytes. Sure, we can do that. It's going to take 6 months and 100 servers working 24/7, but we can absolutely do it. At the end of the day, NAS is probably the most common starting point. And typically, you start on your higher risk, just like you would anything else in a security program. All right, so we have these NAS shares that are open to the whole company. That's a good place to start, because if everyone in the organization can see those shares, everyone could have potentially pulled a copy to their local machine. As companies have grown, data's migrated, things get out of control, they don't necessarily keep track of where things are at, and that's kind of another good starting point. There's a lot of different vendors out there depending on who your DLP vendor is. Most of the major NASs are supported. SharePoint's also starting to pick up rapidly. And the reason for that is SharePoint's kind of a more business-driven tool. And so, as we know, business users aren't always the most security conscious out there. And it's collaboration, it's sharing. That's what SharePoint's the word, the name of it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that, accounts were created correctly. It's a free-for-all sometimes. And so you'd be shocked at what SharePoint sites have. So some companies like to start just on SharePoint now, especially on external-facing stuff. Maybe you've got SharePoint sites that face the web, or SharePoint sites that your partners can use, and that's definitely a common thing to see. The last bullet point there, database is moving up in the world. The challenge there is scaling. Databases, they hold a lot of data real quick. And so DLP wasn't necessarily always built to be as fast as a database can grow, but you can definitely start on a small scale there. Okay, so we've talked about all the tech pieces, how to apply it, what we want to look for, context, policies. Okay, so how do I get value? How do I turn this awesome technology tool into something I report executives and managers and CIOs like? So at this point, you've got to do some triage. You got to go through and what I call mine your gold, right? So if we wrote our policies real carefully, we don't have a lot of false positives, hopefully. So we've got a lot of good, accurate data. At this point, we've got to have somebody who's used to, whether it's just normal incident triage, they don't have to be DLP expert by any stretch. A lot of times they might be a snort analyst, they might have someone with a lot of SIM experience, but they need to go through and say, hey, this is a legitimate broken business process, or this is not. As that person or team of people go through with the tool, they're going to get more comfortable very quickly. They're going to learn your environment. Every Monday, such and such reports go to these companies, so we kind of expect it. And every Thursday at midnight, these reports go out. And so they're starting to get their trends going. The second bullet point there is desirable, but as we know, not always possible. Whoever you decide, or whoever works in DLP on the triage side, if they can do that full time, right? So it's more than just a 1 hour week or month job for him or her, they'll really start to understand and get value. Without that, it can be tough sometimes, because you're just looking at, hey, here's a couple credit card numbers, and I'm just sorting by match count of 10,000. 10,000 credit card numbers or more incident. Yeah, that's good, but that doesn't spot the trends for you. And as far as getting a return on investment on your tool, the more time you spend on triage and reporting, the more you're going to get out of it. I'd say that's almost as important, if not more important, than how many technology resources you throw at the tool. And again, that bullet point there is part of that start slow. If you don't create an incident, if you cannot review it in a timely fashion. And so timely fashion is debatable, right? Is it a day, a week, a month? What you don't want to do is, like some companies I've seen have 2 million incidents, and they're from 2013. And it's 2016 today. So that's great, but at the end of the day, that you could run into some, depending on which lawyers you talk to, that's a pretty big liability, because, oh, I didn't have time to review that email from 2014 that had all this juicy data in it. That's not going to fly usually. So, if you can't triage it, you can't follow up on it, I don't want to see it. Reporting. So we've done the incident triage, we're in the console. How do I create a report? Well, most of the tools have reporting engines built in. Some are better than others. This is kind of the creative side. Sometimes, and I hate this, you might laugh at this, but I still use a lot of Excel here. Create pivot tables, transport it out in Excel. It's not sexy, but it works. And it's something that your business users, your managers can kind of flow into their whatever risk reporting tools they have. There are some other tools out there, depending on what vendors you're with DLP. IT Analytics is one. Some people like to pump it into a SIM tool. I've seen that lately, but whatever you're comfortable with doing, works with your environment, run with the ball. Once you've been doing, reporting for a while, and let's say it takes about a quarter at least, you can start looking at trends. You got a weekly report, you got a monthly report. All right, let's get a quarterly report. Now, long term, here's our top 10 offenders by username or business group. And so each quarter you can kind of start tracking, going, hey, we first rolled out DLP. Here's the 5 groups that were really bad. We started talking to them, reporting to them. They started cleaning up their act. They moved down the list, and now we've got some new things pop up. And so the reporting really gives you that insight. On the reporting side, again, you don't need a really techie resource to do that. A lot of times just a basic business analyst or someone who's worked within the company and the organization, they might do a better job than us just because of the way they think and what their profession is. So let's go into some use cases here. We're staying in a hospital right now. I figure let's talk healthcare. So what's our primary goal? Well, as you know, any healthcare or related company under HIPAA, PHI and PI are usually the 2 biggies. So what are we going to do? We got lucky, as we talked about earlier. There was one system to track all client, past and present, member data, let's say. So we've got one single version, and we're going to export that out every night, or let's say every morning, Saturday morning at 2 a.m. So we get a CSV file dumped into a share somewhere, and then we take our DLP tool and we say, hey, analyze this and create an index. And so it's 10 rows of, let's say, 100 million members. And 2 in the morning, it gobbles that up and creates an index that sits in RAM. So what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to go ahead and turn that index into a policy, and we're going to apply it on network, and we're going to say, hey, well, if the email goes out and it matches that index, as long as that data was clean and accurate, we're going to block because we have a high level of confidence that that's legit data. Go ahead and block it. On the endpoint, we're just going to monitor with that. So we just want to see what's going out there. In addition to the index, we also have some basic we write some regexes to say, hey, here's our unique member ID for our company. It's 15 digits. It starts with AA. It has followed by 4 numbers, followed by the member social. So you've got options there if you're using internally based IDs, things like that, unique identifiers. In addition, we're going to throw some keywords in there. We're going to say, hey, if we see our member ID and we see at least 3 medical-related keywords or more, we want to go ahead and add that to the logic. Where are we going to apply this policy? So that's our policy. We're going to apply it on mail to start with, and we're going to apply it on web traffic. So that's just basic HTTP going out. So if you post to your Yahoo site over the proxy, everything works right, and it says, hey, you shouldn't upload that client file, it's going to block it. It's going to do the same thing on email. Maybe you've been running this a while, and when I send that email out like I'm not supposed to, trying to do my job, I'm going to get a bounce back. I'm going to say, hey, your email was blocked. You need to review security awareness training. This is not allowed. You can go into as much or little detail as your company chooses to, but at the end of the day, you're providing a solution. You're letting the user learn from that mistake and hopefully prevent it moving forward. We're also going to scan unsecured network shares. So those are the company-wide high-risk network shares. And we're also going to apply this to any external-facing SharePoint, mainly because if it's facing the outside, it's higher risk. We assume a lot more people than just us can get to it. In addition, we are going to apply the same policy on the endpoint. Like I said, if you have an approved USB, great. We're going to allow copy to that approved USB. Everything else is blocked. That's going to prevent accidentally losing those USB sticks at the airport, on the road. We all know what happens. Okay, so another use case, small manufacturing. This is actually a company a few hours from here. So you've got a small manufacturing company with a lot of unique engineering designs. And so they use AutoCAD, they use a couple other tools I don't even remember. But during our policy workshop, we sat down for a day or two and talked to them about here's all the tools that we use to design our documents, our manufacturing stuff. Here's all the file formats. We talked about file formats. We talked about what's in it, what's unique. And so we've got a pretty good idea of what our policy needs to look like. So again, we're going to go back to indexing. We are going to have a list of 5 design file types and sizes along with some other numbers that might be on it, some company names, FOUO, some kind of keywords we zoomed in on. And so that policy is going to look for those design documents. In addition, we're going to have a backup policy looking for regular expressions. So maybe that's just looking for part numbers. It's looking for part number along with company name in the design footer because, there's always that data should be there. So where are we going to push this to? Well, this company's a little bit different. They use Office 365, which is a little more of a challenge. But basically, we're going to start with email, and that's egress email. So if that user sends out that design document to his or her Gmail account and it matches this DLP policy, we're going to block it eventually. On the endpoint, you've got a couple new options, and I haven't updated this with some of the latest, but some of the versions of DLP out there today do have a new integration with Office 365, but it is an additional license, and you have to kind of push your data to their preferred cloud solution. So that's hit or miss with certain companies. But in addition to, you can typically hack the endpoint a bit to just monitor Outlook client for Office 365, and depending on how Office 365 is set up in your environment, it will work. I've seen it work. And so that's kind of how you get around that, I can't see because it's encrypted Office 365 traffic. So, okay, so recap. What did we cover today? So we talked about DLP and other security tools. It's all about context, right? If we know what your context is, we know what's important to you, we can try to improve things and move forward. The second bullet point there, again, that's probably a bit different than how we approach other tech tools, but that's that business-driven approach, right? So DLP is a security tool managed by security people, but it's for business, right? So you just kind of want to keep that in the back of your mind. Talked a little bit about the three main vectors there: endpoint, network, and data at rest. Again, at the end of the day, if we can't extract value, we can't report, we can't talk about what we're finding, how we're making the world a better place, can't sell ourselves, it's hard to do anything in the security world. And so we talked about triage and reporting there, and then kind of followed up with some use cases. So that's pretty much DLP in 30 minutes. Is there any questions? I know I kind of rambled a little bit there. Yes, sir.
What is the term
yes, most of the time I've seen it, it's when they went around that business group, thought, shadow IT we call it. Y'all know what that is? They've bought, drives for themselves. DLP is reacting in really two ways. One, on the network side, you can get creative, create some policies, say, hey, if it goes to Dropbox or this, block it. You can also plug that in. I've seen a lot of companies try to implement that at the proxy. So, the network proxies blocking access to those sites. And then a lot of them, where they're going now is they're actually going to the endpoint themselves and adding some new functionality to the endpoint to say, hey, allow or disallow Dropbox or whatever or cloud-based you have. So you've got a couple options depending on your appetite and where your company's at. So there's no concrete answer, but the answer unfortunately depends. Yes, sir.
Is there any guidelines on scaling the target performance?
Yes, there is. Depending on what vendor you go with, they all have them out there. Not to get into an OS holy war here, but Linux and Unix has taken off in this space. It used to be all Windows 10 years ago. A lot of companies are going all Linux, Unix now, at least with DLP that I've seen lately. So, bigger companies, I worked with one that had about 160,000 users, all Linux shop, their number of servers, depending on what you want to do, is over 100. But we knew that, one server with this much RAM, this much CPU, this operating system, Red Hat 6X, would run this many users. That's between 15 and 30,000 at once. And so there are definite out there, and it depends on your vendor, so who you go with. But yeah, if they can't supply that to you, you might want to rethink the vendor. Let me just say that, because you'll get in trouble quick. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Yes, sir. Vendor-wise? In case you saw that first slide, there's really one for medium and large companies. And I'm not bashing the competition. It's just, it's Symantec because they bought what used to be called Vontu back in 2008, I believe they made that purchase. If you've got more than a few thousand users, you got to start worrying about scale. You got to start worrying about break fix. Those are actually, in my opinion, more important than actually what the DLP tool can or can't do. You also have to worry about reporting. If I can't report on a large scale, it's tough. So if you go out there and look and you do really want to roll that endpoint to, what I define a large company is, let's say 5,000 users or more, you really have to take a look and say, hey, do I have to hand install every single one of these endpoints? If that answer is yes, you're not an enterprise tool owner. What do I do when it breaks, right? So you've got small offices scattered throughout Ohio. How do I go out? Do I have to send Nick Burns out there and go unscrew up what may have happened on that box? If that answer is yes. If I cannot do that remotely, it's off the table in my opinion. There are a lot of niche vendors out there. Some of them are really, you're seeing a lot of really cool stuff happen just on the endpoint, where they're basically just an endpoint DLP vendor. Great. That's all you care about. But if you want to, 6 months down the road, your boss, the legal team, the compliance team says, hey, we like what you guys are doing for us. We want you to move the network. We want you to move this. Oh, wait, our DLP vendor we went with doesn't work well in those other spaces. You might want to think twice. I know cost is a concern. There's, WebSense is out there too. If you're a smaller company and you've got WebSense proxies, I have seen some small companies with 2,000, 3,000 people go the WebSense route. But they were really just wanted to focus on network at that point. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Well, appreciate your time. Thank you.